Pode ser o Grupo Corpo ou a Companhia de Dança do Pantanal. Museu de Arte Moderna de São Paulo ou Arte em Cores. Filarmônica de Minas Gerais ou Programa Vale Música. Restauração do Museu Nacional ou da Cripta da Basílica de Nazaré. Onde tem cultura, a Vale está. Dos projetos que todo mundo já conhece, até aqueles projetos que todo mundo precisa conhecer. A cultura brasileira tem o nosso apoio. É valorizando essa cultura que crescemos e evoluímos juntos. Instituto Cultural Vale.
Eu penso que nesses próximos 20 anos, assim como de 2003 para agora, a gente teve um salto muito grande tecnológico e ao mesmo tempo, uma dificuldade muito grande de se entender, eu não acho que isso vai parar. Eu acho que a gente está num fluxo tecnológico e de avanço nesse sentido que só tende a avançar. E nesse avanço tecnológico, com a inteligência artificial e enfim, com tudo que a gente tem tecnológico, a gente tem vantagens, mas em se tratando de arte, de expressão humana e dessa questão da literatura, né, que é do que a gente está falando por causa da Flip, eu fico pensando o quanto isso vai ser afetado nesse próximo futuro aí de 20 anos. Então, eu acredito que esse caminho, nesse futuro próximo, deveria receber uma atenção especial. A literatura, toda a escrita humana, ela é para aumentar a compreensão uns dos outros a partir de um ponto de vista muito pessoal. A partir de onde você olha, você tenta, através da arte, e no caso das palavras e das construções poéticas, né, ou de romance, criar um entendimento do que você vê, de uma forma que interesse aos outros saber o que você pensa, né? E se a gente está exatamente nessa quebra de paradigma do entendimento, da paciência de querer saber como o outro vê, o que o outro vê, o que tem de interessante nisso, e não só como ele lacrou, como ele deu uma patada no outro, essa seria parte da minha utopia, de que a gente não perdesse esse ponto central que a literatura proporciona.
Flip, o encontro da literatura com a cidade. Ministério da Cultura e a Associação Casa Azul apresentam 21ª Flip, Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. A Flip conta com benefício da Lei de Incentivo à Cultura, Lei Rouanet, PRONAC 231427, e possui acessibilidade para pessoas com deficiência física, visual e auditiva. Tem patrocínio Master, Instituto Cultural Vale. Patrocínio Ouro, Itaú. CCR e Caixa. Patrocínio Prata, o Globo, Mac Imóveis e Sebrae. Patrocínio Bronze, Globo Livros e Eletronuclear. Parceria Institucional SESC. Prefeitura de Paraty, Embratur e Museu do Território. É uma concepção, Associação Casa Azul. Realização, Ministério da Cultura, Governo Federal, Brasil, União e Reconstrução. Flip, o encontro da literatura com a cidade.
Good evening, one and all. I'm Milena Brito, one of the curators of Flip, together with Fernanda Bastos, and we are here to hear your nebulosities, this roundtable with Dionne Brand and Angélica Freitas. It's a roundtable that addresses two poets who have long, far-reaching aesthetic projects in their unprecedented desires, re-elaborating belonging in contemporary poetry. This roundtable would be mediated by the translator and director of the Latin American Studies Center and Caribbean Studies Center in London, Jamille Dias. After this wonderful evening, there is going to be a performance this evening after all the roundtables with Marina Visnik in the auditorium out on the town square, and Jamille will introduce our guest writers. Good evening.
É uma imensa.
It's a huge joy for us to share this moment. It's a moment of joy, sharing the stage, the space in the company of Dionne Brand and Angélica Freitas. It's a huge joy, I would say, for us, looking at the words that are behind us in the stage. with unbridled joy, uncontrolled joy, the word, the crossing madness. I would like to thank both of you and Milena, Fernanda, the curators, the producers, the interpreters, and everybody that's worked so hard for this encounter to be possible. Okay, as Milena said, I'm Jamille Pinheiro Dias. I'm a professor and a translator. I'm from Belém do Pará, up in the mouth of the Amazon River, and currently I work at the University of London. So it's a huge pleasure to introduce Dionne, a poet, a novelist, a documentarian. She's worked for a long time as a professor, and great. The experience that I've had in Canada, it was understanding the stature and dimension of Dionne's work, and which marked me deeply as she links activism, aesthetic, and also acknowledges a number of points of convergence with Angélica's poetry, who had the opportunity to talk earlier today about some of the poems. And Angélica, who is from Pelotas in the state of Rio Grande do Sul, she was born in 1973. She wrote books which marked generations. Even people here in the auditorium were certain that I have memories of the uterus the size of a fist. Her book, the daily situations. I remember having read the book in the bus, in bed with my former girlfriend at the pizza restaurant. A lot of effective memories. The uterus the size of a fist, and Rilke shake. I'd like to continue with our conversation earlier today, reading poetry and honoring the fact that we are having lesbian women at Flip. John and Angélica, could we read from No Language is Neutral, which is being published by Bazar do Tempo, the publishing house? Vamos ler.
I think you should begin. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll just follow
Okay.
with the translation. Yeah.
I have a lot of equipment. Yeah. Just a small part from.
Dionne, eles não conseguem te ouvir.
They can't hear you.
How about there? Yes?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's better, right?
Just a small bit from this book, No Language is Neutral. And this part is called in English, Hard Against the Soul. I want to wrap myself around you here in this line so that you will know something. Not just that I am dying in some way, but that I did this for some reason. This grace, you see, come as a surprise, and nothing till now knock on my teeming skull, then these warm, watery syllables, a woman's tongue so like a culture, plunging towards stones not yet formed into flesh, language not yet made. I want to kiss you deeply, smell, taste the warm water of your mouth, as warm as your hands. Lucky is grace that gather me up and forgive my plainness. Oh, thank you.
E agora eu vou ler a tradução, que é de...
I'll read the translation, Jardim Medeiros, the translation by those two.
Quero me enrolar em você aqui nesta linha para que você saiba algo. Não só que estou morrendo de alguma forma, mas que fiz isso por uma razão. Essa graça, veja, chega como que de surpresa e nada até agora bate na minha caveira fervilhante. Assim, essas sílabas mornas, aguadas, a língua de uma mulher como cultura emergindo nas pedras que ainda não se tornaram carne, idioma ainda não formulado. Quero te beijar profundamente, cheirar, saborear a água morna da sua boca tão cálida quanto suas mãos. Sorte minha é a graça me recolher e perdoar a minha modéstia. Dionne Brand.
A translation by Lobi Prates and Jardim Medeiros, as Angélica said.
Diga o nome de quem traduziu.
Tell the name of the people who translated the poems. It's great, wonderful for us to mention Jessa de Oliveira and Silas Flores, who worked in the translation of a door to the place of no return. Rather, a map to the door of no return. Okay, Angélica, what do you think of us following now with your poetry on desire between women? Yes.
Well, good evening, all of you, one and all. Thank you for attending. Thank you for the invitation. This is such a pleasure. It's an honor to be here with Dionne and Jamille. And I guess a poet, of course, has to read poetry more than talk about it. We love to read. Also, we will talk a little bit about the poetry. But we do agree that reading is essential. So I'd like to read a couple of poems I wrote based on a number of series by Cláudia Andujar. She had these pictures made of a woman from Bahia called Sonia in the 80s. And it's a beautiful series of pictures. It's not very well known by Andujar. And then the magazine, the publishing Zoom, asked me a series of poems maybe 5 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. And so this is my understanding. So these are very short poems within a series of poems. And it's called A Sonia. Sonia. I like the series, the pictures also. So, A Sonia. There's nothing wrong. Those breasts, those arms. If someone wanted to know the stomach, ribs, the belly button, we wanted everything. To want the legs of another woman, so that after the love, you can be on all four legs. Some will say, oh, that's exactly what we needed. Loved, vaccinated. You have taken a liquid that made you light up when everything was dark. This morning, did you go to the beach? You are blonder than the moon itself. Leave me just to stop and think that your hairs are like clouds and that you stop thinking because you are actually in the clouds.
And Dionne, could you tell us a little bit about the context in which you wrote Hard Against the Soul, if it's right what we just heard?
to thank a few people because this book was made by many people. Even my own writing of it is made by many people. And I want to thank the translators, Luby Prates, Jade Medeiros, Fernando Silva de Sousa, and also Fernando Silva y Sousa for the front matter, and Tatiana Nascimento for the postscript, and Ana Cecilia Martins for publishing it. Yes, and for publishing the book of essays also, Hard Against the Soul, which, let me use my bad Portuguese, which is in Portuguese, Pau Tirado de Pedra, right? How's that? Más o menos. Okay. So I want to thank people for bringing my work into this space and into this community. The context of writing that book, it was called No Language is Neutral, is the name of the entire book. And the line is taken from a poem by Derek Walcott, the poet Derek Walcott, which says, "No language is neutral. The green oak of English is a murmurous cathedral where some take umbrage and some take peace, but all shadows widen its shade." And I wanted to think about coloniality and English, the English language, the way that it spread around the world along with the oppressions of the Middle Passage and enslavement of black peoples in the Americas. I wanted to take all that into account, but I wanted to take it into account in terms of how black women were organized in it, or how black women understood and felt the oppression of the language and all it signified. And that included questions of sexuality, questions of the location of women in these oppressions. And I wanted to pull all of this together using the very matter of language itself, how we speak of ourselves, how we come to be spoken of, and to contest, to work in that terrain. My work is always in this political terrain of anti-oppression, of anti-colonialism, and this climate of anti-woman, anti-woman and anti-blackness. And so the whole book comes from this impetus, as perhaps does all my work, attending to the ways in which we find and seek liberation. Does that answer this question a little bit?
Com certeza.
Just a little bit.
Com certeza.
Yes, of course, definitely. And thinking also this quest, this work that links politics and aesthetics, I would like to evoke the presence here of Adrienne Rich, of whom we spoke earlier, and also considering language and shift and displacement with translation in this case. Displacement. I remember a letter that you wrote to Adrienne Rich when you communicated. It was June 1994, I believe, right? And, well, this is recorded in a film which Angélica and myself were watching. Beautiful film. It's full, available in full on YouTube. And there you said to Adrienne that you wrote thinking of something different from the nation state as a way of seeking health. Health is in something different from the nation state. And I bring this point as a way of us approaching the fact that you, both of you, lived experiences of displacement. Dionne, in her adolescence, leaving Trinidad, Tobago, and going to Canada, and Angélica also had a number of experiences in Scotland, Argentina, and now in Germany. And I would like to discuss this issue of language and displacement of the body and shifts, and how this impacts you, the way that you think poetry, the possibility of conceiving and thinking based on poetry. I can start. Fine. I have been a lesbian since I was a small child. I'm from a small town in Rio Grande do Sul, the southernmost state of Brazil. And something was always clear for me, that I would have to leave my town, my hometown. Okay, I was born in 1973. My discovery of my sexuality was in the 1980s, the late 1980s. And at that time, there was no internet, there was no Google, nobody to talk with. And it was a frightening place for me, scary, violent. And so that was it. I don't know how it must be to be born somewhere and to think, I'm going to stay here for my entire life, because for me it was clear that I would have to leave first my father's house and leave my town, preferably both at the same time. So I had an experience as a very young child. I left home when I was 19, and my tendency was to think of places as far away as possible. And so I went to Scotland because it was a place where I knew a few people before, and I ended up staying in Scotland for a while. And also, Dionne spoke in English as a language of colonialism, the language of colonialism, and I agree with her. But for me also, being on the periphery of everything was like a channel to have access to other voices, other women's voices, which I couldn't find in Brazil, and ended up finding in these travels. So this displacement was always present in my life. When I could experience my life in safety, I'd have to leave for me to live in safety. And this involved learning foreign languages. I remember the first time that I entered a bookshop looking for books by lesbian women. This was in the 1990s. I went to Waterstone's bookshop, and there was a shelf of literature, and it was gays and lesbians at the time. There were no acronyms back then, and there were 3 books by lesbian authors, and I purchased all 3 of them. And one of them was called How to Be a Lesbian, was the title. That was important for me. Several ideas that I still have to this day, but it was great because it said, okay, look, you're not alone in the world. Queen Gertrude Stein, Queen Christine, and it was important. When you're young, you're not the only one in the world. You have people who are like you, Sapphists, who began this movement. And so another thing that I wanted to say, Dionne, I think it was important to coming from Brazil and reading the book, How to Be a Lesbian. It was written by a white English woman, and she said how important it was for us to think of solidarity with other minorities, for people, black people, other minorities in Brazil. It's not a minority in Brazil. At that time, in the 1990s, we hadn't discussed the racial issues much back in the 1990s. And this, I think, to be born, to see yourself as a lesbian woman already puts you in a place of thinking, who else? Who else is in this boat? Who else is being oppressed in some way? But it was important for me to have read that we should join forces, we should unite, that we're all together.
I have to take your question from various levels, yeah? My political awakenings, which I consider my sexuality a kind of political awakening too, begin around the realization of really in history. So I always have to go back 500 years to come to the present, yeah? And that moment of the Middle Passage and the transportation of black people to these Americas and the population of these Americas by black people and their condition, their continued condition, which result and continue in the wake of that particular apocalyptic moment, suggested to me that this is a kind of aleph, a kind of space into which a set of demands could be made and could be thought through, a set of propositions about the way to live, right? A set of breaking out of a set of regimes of living, which designate certain people in the world as the people who are oppressed, and certain people in the world who are the people who benefit from that oppression. And so this thinking about this history made me think about all histories, yeah? The history of women, the history of sexuality, the history of masculinity and femininity, if you will, and how that works within these regimes, right? So it was, for me, the kind of breakage. That moment signaled a breakage with history, with what is called history, and therefore allowed me a way to see the world, or a way to open that seeing in the world, a way then to experience my own self and my own body as the possibility of my own self and my own body as opening out into something. I'll tell you a small story. I'm a little girl, I'm about 8 years old. Usually in my neighborhood, I'm the boss of the group of children, right? One day, the boy across the street has a birthday party, and the neighborhood decides they're going to this birthday party, and now we must all dress up in nice little dresses and go to this birthday party. And I like the dress, yes, it's a very pretty dress, but it's confining in a little way, right? So it's doubled, right? It's contradictory, this dress, yeah? Because suddenly I am not the tomboy anymore who manages all the children in the neighborhood, but I'm supposed to be a girl. What is this ascription? What is this condition that I must suddenly enter and leave all of my instincts, all of my desires, all of my bravery, all of my everything behind? And so I go to the party, and they have the girls sitting here and the boys sitting there, and they say that we must wait on these boys to come ask us to dance, and I think, this is appalling. This is appalling. I cannot live this way. Okay? I simply cannot live this way. It is uncreative, it is confining, it is whatever. And that boy, I was his boss, and now I am his. So these moments of realization, and I'm sure you've all had them, where you suddenly are confined to a certain set of strictures, a certain set of someone telling you ways of loving and who to love and how to love them. And so my own life has been a life of awakening to histories, whether they are histories of major kind of populations and major moments in that historical way, or the histories of sexualities, and the possibilities that we might live quite differently. And then, who wants us not to live this difference, and why? And so I'm always trying to break open those structures, as I am always trying to break open the structures of language and how one must speak, and what is being prevented from being spoken in the regimens of speaking, and in the regimens of living, and in the regimens of experiencing oneself in the world as a human being. Yeah.
Yes, true. Dionne's poetry will truly open these different windows, these different cracks for us to breathe in language. It will open different territories, subjectivity, space. And, well, personally, it is a poetry that helps me to be more alert to certain things. And always, bringing me back to the connection between politics and aesthetics, which I was referring to shortly. And if you allow me, also to include Mrs. R, an excerpt of a poem, and it's in Portuguese. It would be more or less justice is listening at the door of beauty. Justice listens at beauty's door. And would you like to talk a little bit about this Césaire, what it represents to you?
Césaire, like the poets Aimé Césaire or Kamau Brathwaite or Derek Walcott, or so many poets of engagés, are my genealogy, if you will, right? When we enter the world and the language that describes us in the world is not adequate or sufficient, we must break the language and make more language. And so I've taken my job, in a sense, to do that breakage all the time. This is why I love poetry, because it allows for that capacity, the capacity of language to open, to break and open, and to put different things in juxtaposition with each other as we perhaps truly feel it, as we perhaps truly experience it, and to try to find finer and finer ways of coming to a description of, not even of what we are, but what we might be, right? And that is the politics of that. And so when I came upon a poet like Aimé Césaire, I realized this fabulous breakage of language, which is a breakage of the kind of regimens, of race, of capital, of every oppressive condition, in a way, right? And this is the promise of poetry, right? That you can leap. This is the whole idea of a metaphor. It's a leap from one thing to another, one thing into another, to make the completely most disparate things the same things, in a way. This is what I love about poetry. I think about it as a kind of metal, a kind of soft metal that one works in, yeah? So I'm a metallurgist of some kind. But at every moment, to break language so that the world and the regimes of the world don't lock us into very small people, yeah? Into very small people with very small concerns, but that concern moves outward, that language opens up and moves outward and doesn't become administrative language, because we are in the presence of these regimes that capture language all the time, right? You know, if you think of advertising, and if you think of an administrative language that the government uses and so on, and we become used to using this language too. You know, if you think of Nike, like just do it, and then all of a sudden we're all using these expressions. But these expressions are actually taken sometimes from people, from the popular, right? And then fabricated as advertising, something to sell us something. And we must retrieve this language all the time and break it open all the time. And that is what artists do. Not just poets, but all kinds of writers, all kinds of musicians always break this language so that we can look at ourselves anew again and look at our possibilities rather than our limitations. Yeah? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
E aí, claro que...
And of course, like Angélica is amazing in identifying, pinpointing these common places, this feeling, so to speak, and how Angélica is able to get, inside jokes, play of words as a material for something else, the way that you compose your poetry. I'm in awe. I'm always bewildered. I'm in awe, and I have so much fun reading your work. Thank you. I'm glad to know. And so I feel that, I guess each one of you, each one in your own way, you have been inventing a language to talk about the future also. We talked a little bit about this earlier today when we talked together about how language is inhabited by futures, potential futures. And would you maybe like to talk a little bit about this and talk about these potential futures, the possible futures in language? Well, there's a poet, a Portuguese poet called Inês Lourenço, and in one of her poems, I can't remember the name, but maybe in an interview, I'm not sure, she says that vat and vaticinate have the same root. Vat, a poem, a poet. And I guess there's a lot of truth there in this discovery by Inês de Lourenço. There are lots of mysterious things in poetry that I am unable to explain. And well, I guess it's better to live and accept these mysteries of these things that present themselves and are created in poems and can, yes, give you maybe a hint of what's to come. So vaticinar is to predict in English. So as a mantra, people for some time, there's this sentence from a playwright called Heiner Müller, a German playwright, and he said something like, I write more than what I know, or more than I have knowledge about. And this really opens an immense field for things to happen and on a page, and that can give you maybe hints about the future, things that you will decode and understand maybe years ahead. But this is one of the most powerful things in poetry, that when you write poetry, and that it is such a privilege to do it, to be able to get involved with this art. Dionne?
I think of making poetry as trying very hard to say the perfect thing. Of course, that's impossible. Right? And so you try the next line, you try to say the perfect thing. I think of it, and I've written an essay about it called A Kind of Perfect Speech. Right? So one attempts all the time to say the thing perfectly. Well, what does that mean? Yeah. It means to say it with all its affects in some way. And I keep trying to make verse that says the perfect thing about that moment that I'm trying to describe. And that moment that I'm trying to describe has, in this moment, all of you in it, the red light above, my figure here, the lights here, and the sound of the room. How do I put that into something all together and reproduce it so that someone else reads it and hears it all and thinks it all? And how do I put the situation of the world in that line also, at the present? How do I put what is happening in Gaza together in my speech here with you, accompanied by the sound of the room, the lights, the figure of myself, Angélica here, Jamille here. How do we exist in this same moment? In some senses, I will always fail, but my next poem will try it again. I will pick it up there. I will pick up our common enterprise, an enterprise I hope is common, or this is the hope that I produce in the line or in the stanza. I will hope that I put all of it in it, and then I will move to the next stanza, and if it doesn't happen in this book, I hope it happens in the next book, and so on, right? So in that sense, I put a desire in the poem that will reach into the next book. And hopefully, like, perhaps it's a desire that will reach into the next world, right? I'm always speaking, I think, into the next world. There's a lovely piece of music by John Coltrane called Venus. And when you listen to this piece of music, you think, what year has this been recorded in or played in? Because it's so much speaking to the future world, the world we might live in, right? It's always present, and then it's always future. And so I try to attack the words in this way too, knowing that I will fail to do that, and then the next book I will try again, right? So I'm constantly trying to make this perfect speech all the time, right? Okay, so for now, this is what...
Maravilhosa.
Amazing.
One more thing. I was telling you today about it. The poet Derek Walcott also writes something like, and I'm paraphrasing badly again for you both, after this sentence, rain will fall. And I think that is what I want the poem to do. After the poem is written, something will happen. Like something will change in the nature, in the humidity of the room, right? And of course it never does, right? So I must try again to write this kind of poem after which the world is different, right? I'm always writing into the world that we live in, which is oppressive, and which I mean to make different by placing this language here in it. Yeah. Yeah.
Quero convidar você.
I was going to invite you also to ask questions. You from the audience, feel free, please. There's slips of paper that you can write your questions on, and we will read them up here on the stage. Dionne, I would like to invite you or ask you to talk a little bit more about the relationship between language and oppression. And there's a phrase from Angela Davis that I thought was powerful, which I tend to associate with both poetic writing and the translation, which is English. Walls, stars, sidewalks are the walls knocked down become bridges. Walls that are knocked down become bridges. In a free translation, where it's possible to walk across the bridges. And I bring the memory of this reference because, and I'm quoting here because Angélica just said a few minutes ago, talked about forming networks of solidarity and the construction of a coalition among different struggles, uniting different struggles, connections, intersectional connections between struggles. You talked about what was happening in Gaza, and historically, there's an alliance between the anti-racist struggle in the United States with the Palestinians and the people of Gaza. And I wonder and ask about the role of translation now, this moment of the exacerbation of a crisis of understanding, and what kind of bridges can we create through language? It's an open question. Bridges that can be built through language.
I think that literature has done those things. I think that poetry has done those things across time. I think, you know, in my case, I'm just picking up on a struggle that has arrived at this space. I think that people have built enormous solidarities across global solidarities that we can see that are expressed in poems, that are expressed in songs, that are expressed in all of the protests and demonstrations across the world, where people see the similarity of struggle, and that is what leads them out into the streets, you know, to pick up the struggles of, you know, Palestinian freedom, or to pick up black struggle during the pandemic, for example, with the killings of George Floyd and so many other people in the United States. You saw masses of people, you know, walk out into the streets in Paris, in London, everywhere, and that is the poetics. That is, you know, the poesia of living, right, where people make those connections affectively and really, and that is the best poetry, right? My poetry is minor in comparison to the poetry of the street and the poetry of affective relations. Yeah? Yeah.
Obrigada.
Thank you. There's a question from Lourdes for Dionne. It's a question. Let's see whether I understand it, if we can understand it together. For you to talk about the relationship, diacritical relationship between poetry and narrative.
Where is Lourdes? Okay. I have said foolishly that sometimes the difference between poetry and prose, not always, right? But a real difference is that the poem interrogates the reader, but the reader interrogates prose. Yeah? So you read a novel and you think you can ask the novel, oh, no, I don't think that happened. That could not have happened, right? That might have happened. I don't believe you because you didn't put a tree. You didn't put, you know, a street. That's improbable. But the poem is always improbable. So the poem asks the reader, are you probable? Are you, yeah? So there's a kind of a difference between these two things. And so the poem is always making a note underneath the sentence, if you will, or striking through the language, saying, maybe you don't recognize this language, right? The poem sometimes says, as what a lot of your poems do, say, who are you? Yeah? So the poem asks the reader, well, who are you and will you enter? It's a different proposition in a way. And that is what I meant by the diacritical of a poem. Yeah. Angélica has a lot of poems this way too, right? Where you don't know quite where you are, but you cannot ask the poem where, you cannot tell the poem to locate you. You have to find your location in the poem, correct?
Eu diria que sim.
I believe so. I would say so. And there's something also, Dionne, when I give poetry workshops, I love to do the following exercise. I show a text which is, we could identify it as a poem because it's written in verse, right? Okay, and a text which is a block of text, and I ask people, when you see this kind of text that we understand as a poem, do you approach it differently than a text which on the page it's formatted, and they always say yes, right? Okay, so that already begins. If you look at the page, that's where it starts, the whole question. We have more questions streaming in. There's a question concerning the genealogy of readings and poets which are part of your lives. You talked about Césaire and Walcott. I would like to ask this question for both of you, actually, Angélica and Dionne. Maria Rita asked this question for the panel. Okay, you know, Dionne, that of those books, the 3 books that I bought back then in Scotland, in that only shelf of gay and lesbian books, there was an anthology of poetry by lesbian women in English, which I don't know if you read it. It's called Naming the Waves. And so I was lucky because amongst these poets there was Audre Lorde, that poem called Stations, a wonderful poem. I can't recite it now by memory, but of course for me it was absolutely transformative. I didn't have the slightest idea of who Audre Lorde was, even. And so for me, since I left my hometown and I traveled across all the libraries, the municipal libraries, looking for voices of women who were like me, I couldn't find any. Having found these voices was a treasure, literally, for me. And some voices, some women still as bedside books which renew several things, renew my desire to write, to renew my thinking about writing. And for example, Gertrude Stein is one of them. And over the course of my life, different kind of readings of Gertrude Stein, I think that she is endless, infinite, and I love a provocation from Gertrude Stein, which was, she quotes a poem of the Mother Goose collection for the nursery rhymes. In this poem, there's a phrase which is, I'm myself because my puppy recognizes me. So I'm me because I come home and my puppy knows that it's me. But she says that it's not because my puppy recognizes me. So it's kind of Kwanzaa. And I love thinking of this when I write also, that what is there is not me because the puppy, this imaginary puppy, comes running when I come home. And I also love, I enjoy, it's a figure which is extremely important for me, was a Brazilian poet called Ana Cristina César. Perhaps for the poets of my generation, she was the main influence, Ana Cristina César. And perhaps also, there's always a kind of doubt because people don't talk clearly about her sexuality, and her poems, it comes through. It's very powerful. Okay. So I'm very grateful for these voices that are still with me.
In my case, I think of poets like when I was 17 and discovered Nikki Giovanni, the African-American poet, and I just loved her. And I loved Gwendolyn Brooks, and I loved Rita Dove, and I loved Muriel Rukeyser. I loved and was friends with Adrienne Rich. I was very grateful for her friendship. So many poets, and of course Audre Lorde, the great Audre Lorde, who did so much work on lesbian existence, yeah, and lesbian life, and went all around the world meeting women and talking to women and thinking with women. I spent some time being in the same place with her and not quite meeting her, right? Which was really interesting. But of course, there are many other women writers that I love and follow and take my lead from. The great Toni Morrison, who, if she wasn't a novelist, would be a poet. Do you know what I mean? Her work is so absolutely stunningly crafted. Courage and possibility, yeah? And why? Because they spoke about the world from the position of with integrity and as speakers into the real world, not just in the second row. Yeah? They understood themselves as present and powerful and having something to say about the world. Yeah. Yeah.
We have a few more minutes, just a few more minutes. We're drawing close to the end. We have two more questions, which I'm going to combine both questions in one, before which both Dionne and Angélica are going to be signing their books out at the Flip bookstore outside in just a few minutes after the session. The great questions that we've received from the audience for both of you. Hélène Fernandes, the poet needs to eat. A poet needs to eat. Poetry, does poetry help pay the bills? That was the first question.
No, it does not pay the bills. I often say it doesn't. It makes a life. You cannot make a living, but it makes a life. Yeah. And it's a great life. We're so lucky. Even though I must tell you, it's very agonizing to write these poems, but it's a wonderful life. It's a wonderful life in the mind. Yes. Do you make a living?
Não.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But I swear that I'm not on this path because of money. Things happen, and I think I'm extremely lucky, tremendously lucky, because I write poetry. And like our last question today, the conversation is wonderful. It's flowing. I hope that it plants seeds for other conversations, but after all, we're drawing close to the end of the session. We have a question from Michele Flores. for both of you, based on something that Dionne said, but opening up for both of you to answer. Dionne, you said that you seek writing a verse which alters language and space. Do you believe in poetry as a small earthquake in language? Do you believe that it's possible to make poetry without producing some thunder or earthquakes, some shaking the structures? Can you make poetry without an earthquake?
Maybe that would be my new project. I don't know. Can you make poetry without making an earthquake? You know, poetry is also a very humble art, right? So, for me, I set out with great ambition, but I know I must be humble in front of the words, because perhaps I can't make the earthquake, but I set out to make the earthquake. Clearly, I have not made the earthquake, but, yeah, but I set out with this ambition, yeah?
Mm-hmm. That's it. Não tenho.
Well, I guess that you put it so well. Dionne says it so well, and I guess we would need a roundtable just to talk about that. Maybe, I guess that's the intention in the beginning. But there are many things that happen, behind the scenes, many attempts, and it's such a pleasure when this explosion, this thunder happens. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you.